I kept trying to ask them, like, so why didn't you go public? And they're like, why didn't we become purple? I mean, it wasn't even part of their mindset to go public. And part of that is that when you go public, the incentive structure changes, right? If you're Tim Cook at Apple, you could make $10 million personally from a deal. You're never going to lose $10 million personally from a deal. That's going to be dispersed among shareholders. Brown Brothers still, every deal they do, it's partners' money. And they could lose the money.
My guest today is Zachary Karabell. Zachary is a prolific author on the subjects of history, economics, and international relations, having written 13 books. His latest book is Inside Money, Brown Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power. The book is a sweeping history of the legendary private investment firm and how it has evolved from the early 1800s to the present. Inside Money gives the reader a tour of American finance and the massive role Brown Brothers played in building our nation. I recently sat down with Zachary, and we talked about how Brown Brothers helped create the capital market system and lessons we can learn from their approach to finance. Zachary, thanks so much, man, for coming on the show. I greatly appreciate it. And after I read your book, it just like, wow, I had to speak to you because there were so many things that I learned. And let's get right to it. The name of the book is Inside Money, Brown Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power. Welcome to the show, man.
Thank you, Charles.
Okay, Zachary, you wrote a lot of books, man, 13 of them. And this is number 13. My first question is, why did you pick Brown Brothers to write about? When I worked on Wall Street, I used to pass their office building. I didn't think anyone living still worked there. It was about as boring as can be. Their logo wasn't a logo. It's just the name on a building. You never saw anyone walk in or out. I never met anyone on Wall Street who came from Brown Brothers. So why did you pick what seems to be a boring, staid, non-flashy company to write a book about?
Well, first, and thank you for that scintillating introduction to the topic. I wanted to write a book about the crucial and central role of money in creating American power in the 19th century, and then the way in which the men who made the money, and they were all men, and this is a book about white men, for better and for worse, and how the men who made the money of the 19th century then created the global economic and to some degree international system of the 20th century. So the men who made the money of the 19th century create the international system of the 20th, and the partners of Brown Brothers in the middle of the 20th century are crucial to the formation of everything that we now, the architecture of the world that we live in today. The World Trade Organization, the United Nations, the national security state, the Pentagon, the Defense Department, all of which are outgrowths of World War II, and of which several Brown Brothers partners were sort of present, as Dean Acheson said, at the creation. And then kind of what happened, right? Where did that sort of mid-20th century WASP establishment elite, what happened to it? And what replaced it in the late 20th and early 20th century? And there's no firm that can tell that story other than Brown Brothers, because they were around from 1800 and they're still around today, even though most people don't even realize that they're still around today. And I didn't realize when I wrote the book. So I knew two things when I wrote the book. I knew what you just said, that they were kind of this, staid men of rectitude, and that was going to be a challenge to write a narrative about. And it's one of the reasons why there's no book about them, right? And I did that once before in my writing career. I wrote a short biography of the Chester Alan Arthur, who most people don't even know was president of the United States in 1881, and is therefore not one of the more memorable presidents. But I think it's interesting to write about things that no one writes about, as long as there's a reason. And the fact that they've been around for 225 years is not in and of itself a reason. Like, living long is not necessarily living interesting. But they are a way to tell the story I just told about. But as I got into the book and as I learned about them in a way that I didn't fully know, both their 19th century presence in the United States was much more central than I think I even realized. And the fact that they are still around exactly as you just described, and the fact that their profile is as you described it, I think says something profound about what Wall Street has become and what the financial system's become, and says something profound in a not good way about what Wall Street has become and what it could have been or could still morph into in the future.
Okay, hold on to all of that 21st centric stuff. We'll get to that in a second. But yeah,
That's my tease.
I
That's my
got you.
tease.
I got you. For those who do want to continue listening, do so. If it's not going to be, it's. And you know what I find fascinating about this book, and I'll tell you how I found you. Every Saturday, I look through the review section of the Wall Street Journal, and I look through all the book reviews there, which are great. I live for that. You know, that Saturday edition of the when it doesn't come on Saturday, I get really peeved. But that 4 sections of the Wall Street Journal, the review section has a tremendous amount of books, tremendous amount of wisdom in there. You can just read the reviews, and some of them are absolutely great. I saw your book. I said, you know, I'm always interested in economic history, how we became what we are, and why the United States became what it is. What were the differences? And your book wasn't an easy read. It wasn't something that you'd sit down, you know, just breeze through it. It was a little dense at times. You'd go into a lot of detail, a lot of stuff. I found myself going, blah, but then you start moving on, B&O Railroad, and holy smokes. So with that, with that setup, I want to step all the way back to the beginning of the book. Because like Lehman Brothers, which started in cotton, in the South, the Brown family started there as well. And when you read the history of Brown Brothers and later Brown Brothers Harriman, it's really the economic development of the United States through this firm, no?
Yep.
Okay.
No, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, they are, I joked at one point, they're a little like the Zelig of American financial history. Like at every crucial moment of the evolution of the United States, there's a Brown Brothers banker in the second row, back left, looking like a banker, who has no interest in being the story, but without whom there is no story.
Right.
You know, they are the lubricant for the system that makes these things possible. Whether it's the creation of the first major passenger steam railroad in the United States and frankly in the world. I mean, the B&O Railroad was the first.
Right. Hold on. Don't get ahead there. Don't get ahead there.
Don't get ahead to B&O. All right, we're not.
Let's go right. Let's from the beginning. So you have this immigrant. Start us from there. He comes from Ireland to the United States and gets into the cotton business, linens. Right? It was linens.
Linens. He was an Irish linen merchant.
Okay.
Linen was the big product of Ireland. He flees the Troubles. Alexander Brown flees Belfast. He was probably, you know, upper middle class, successful merchant caught in the Protestant, Catholic, English triangle that, you know, was besetting Ireland in the late 18th century and obviously continued to until the late 20th century. And he goes to Baltimore because he had a cousin in Baltimore in 1800.
And Baltimore was a pretty cool place back in the 1800s. It's an economic hub.
Yes.
Why?
Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York had already supplanted Boston as the primary kind of economic trading hubs with Britain. And even after the Revolutionary War, the primary economic relationship between the United States and the world was with Great Britain. So all the trade went through either Baltimore, Philadelphia, or New York. Some obviously went through.
And why is Baltimore? Why is Baltimore so important? Why is trade center around there?
Well, first of all, because it was close to the tobacco South up until 1800. So all those tobacco plantations needed to ship their tobacco abroad. They did so through Baltimore. And then as tobacco gave way to cotton, which it does sort of starting the 1790s with Eli Whitney, the cotton gin, you know, the ability to mass produce cotton, Baltimore becomes the primary cotton trading hub to Liverpool, which was the primary hub in the UK. And that's how the Brown family makes its really big money, is getting into the cotton trade, moving out of the linen trade. They trade a lot of other stuff. And I mean, at one point in the 1820s, they trade just about everything there is to be traded.
Right.
And they own a bunch of ships. But they get into the cotton trade, as you just alluded, with Lehman Brothers. I mean, in many ways, the Brown family, the Brown Brothers of the 19th century, are like the earlier precursor WASP version of the Lehman Brothers, but a very different culture. You know, and part of the book is about that.
Forget the culture; it was the opportunity there, and people don't realize that cotton was the semiconductors of their day. They were everywhere, ubiquitous. They were important. They had a large percentage of GDP, especially in the United States at the time. They were extremely important. And the most important thing about that was that you needed a way to facilitate buyer and seller transactions because, as you write in the book, there's no clearinghouse between two parties.
Right. And there's no foreign exchange system. So all the cotton is grown in the United States and sold in Britain. So it's grown in a dollar economy and it's sold in a pound economy. And someone had to figure out what the right ratio was between dollars and pounds without there being any international clearing. Right? There's no printed rate. And the Browns become so important to the cotton trade. First of all, they control somewhere between 10 and 15% of the cotton trade by 1830. And a lot of that has to do with Alexander Brown's older son, William Brown, who he dispatches to Liverpool and who becomes a grandee in Britain. In fact, becomes a member of parliament, one of the richest men in Liverpool. I mean, I could have written a whole book about the English legacy of Brown Brothers, which becomes something called Brown Shipley. And they become such a trusted merchant of cotton that their rates, right, what is a dollar worth in pounds, become the rates for a while. They were called Brown's published rates, and they were used by all the other merchants as the reference point for how to do this. The other thing which you allude to is, and this wasn't a cotton issue as much as it's always been a transatlantic or ocean-bearing trade issue, is if I part with my goods, if I'm a cotton merchant and I want to sell something abroad, how do I know someone's going to actually pay me for it on the other side? Because once the cotton leaves my, it's gone. And if you're someone on the other side and you want to know, how do I know that I'm going to get the goods if I pay for them? And so you always needed, that's what merchants do, right? They solve for that problem. And the Browns quickly sort of move away from being physical merchants of cotton to paper facilitators of all the cotton trade. Also because they don't want to, there's only so much you can scale the physical trade. You need ships and you need bulk and
warehouses,
and it's a capital intensive business.
Right.
They also, they didn't want to be complicit in the slave system, even though they were completely complicit in the slave system. And the more they could kind of take one step away by just dealing with paper and not dealing with the physical trade of cotton and having agents in Mobile and having agents in New Orleans, they could kind of semi-rationalize their complicity in a system that they knew was profoundly immoral, but which they were profiting immensely from.
Well, we could say the same thing today with the way iPhones are made in sweatshops in China and, in terms of a lot of the goods we get from China and how they're made and whatever it might be, we're complicit in a sense since we're buying it, but we don't promote it. It's not something that we're proud of doing. It's a necessary, I wouldn't say necessary evil. It's something that we try to stay arm's length away from.
Right.
So
and
I totally get it.
That was their issue. I mean, one of the things that I realized also in writing the book was, it occurred to me that I'd never, I got a PhD in American history and I thought about these things, but I hadn't thought about them in this way. That one of the reasons that Lincoln says on the eve of the Civil War that, you can't have a nation that's half slave and half free, was the recognition that so much of the Northern economy, and again, Brown Brothers is exhibit A for this, was embedded in profiting from cotton. So that even if you weren't growing it, even if you weren't working a plantation, you were benefiting from the system. I think part of what he was saying was the reality of the United States was a half slave nation was literally an entirely slave economy. So you couldn't have a half free, half slave because they weren't separate economies. They were one economy that the North was benefiting from. And if that was morally untenable at some point, you had to end it, which the British had done way earlier, by the way.
Yeah, but hang on. The British did away with it on their shores, but we're certainly happy to do it on our shores and let us do the dirty work. So
the outsourcing of morality.
Yeah, that's what we're doing today with semiconductors and the whole electronics. So it's hard to judge. It's not hard. I think it's morally wrong to judge a society out of context of their time.
Yeah,
so,
and I think in the book, my point in this is one can acknowledge, look at, and confront without judging.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm totally good. You don't have to go any further than that. So for this relationship, to have buyer and seller for a transaction, where you have, by the way, the Rothschilds were the same way. They send, he sends his sons to the four corners of the earth. They're the trusted agents to facilitate, because there's no capital market system.
Right.
There's no way to get goods from A to B with currency, with fluctuations and currency exchange, as well as you need someone with a solid reputation in order to say, I'll take the money, charge a fee, and make sure the other party is going to get it and charge a fee there. It's a brilliant system, and I think the term that the Browns used was the William and his father, character is king.
Yep.
Right. That reputation was everything, and I think the term was shoemaker know thy last.
Right. Stick to thy last, which
Stick
was
to thy
Alexander
last.
Brown's constant. And he writes all these letters to his kids from 1800 till his death in the early 1830s. And they're like this compendium of homilies. They read like some weird amalgam of Polonius's wisdom and Poor Richard.
It's like Poor Richard's. Yeah, I was thinking of Poor Richard's. Ben Franklin. I was reading. I guess that was the style in those days, right?
It was. And he's constantly lecturing his kids and drumming home these, what we would consider to be kind of business cliches. Character, trust is hard to gain and easy to lose. Only go into business with reputable people. Know your customers.
Well, that's the same thing everyone does every year when they flock to Omaha, Nebraska to listen to Berkshire, to Warren Buffett. You can't make a good deal with a bad person,
Right. No, it's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. The Buffett example is perfect. But unlike Buffett, they actually create a multi-generational business. And what's, I guess, fascinating about Brown Brothers is, look, by the time Lehman Brothers implodes, there are no Lehmans left. There are no Brown's family members running Brown Brothers. There was 4 generations that did run it. But the culture remained completely what Alexander Brown lays out in 1810, this kind of, where a time of chaos is not a time to take risk. The time to be prepared for a crisis is before, not during. Crises will happen, right? This was a kind of a culture and a family that understood that you better go to sleep every night prepared for the world changing negatively tomorrow, because it does and it will and it always has, and you'll never know when, right? Nobody writes you a letter the day before and says, oh, by the way. So they kind of run a business.
Well, they say in the market, nobody rings a bell at the top. So no one's going to ring a bell and tell you tomorrow. So your reputation better be good. The people you do business with better be accountable, and you better have vetted them properly, did the right exchange rate. So your books are really even at the end of the night, and that's so the opposite of what Wall Street became.
Right. And that's what's fascinating. Yeah. Right. That this and that culture in no way precluded them making a lot of money. Right. Alexander Brown was one of the richest men in the United States in the 1830s. We don't remember it the way we remember the Astors, right? Because the Astors wanted their name everywhere. So it's like Astor Place and foundations. We don't remember it the way we remember Morgan. Vanderbilt or Carnegie.
Morgan.
They wanted their names out there. So the other part of the culture was your clients and your business and the family is what matters, not your name. Meaning not your name in public. This was a press-shy family, and it's a press-shy firm. Right? This is a firm who, in the 19th century, for the family, and in the 20th century and into the 21st, does not want a book written about them. Right? And there's a reason that there's no books written about them, because unlike all those others, their aspiration to greatness was much more embedded in what they were doing and in what they achieved than it was in making their name famous.
Right. You don't see like a trader from Brown Brothers did so and so today, or took a huge position and almost sunk the firm, or bought CMOs and CDOs back in 2000. You didn't even hear about them in 2008 during the financial crisis. They weren't too big to fail. They weren't over leveraged. They weren't involved in any of this crap and survived. Yeah, but let's hold on to that, because I definitely want to get. You just jumped 200 years. I'm still fascinated with what happened at the point, because I think it's so important. Many of us wake up on third base, thinking we hit a triple. But it's these guys who built this financial system that sets America apart and really propels America way ahead of every other nation on earth, because they created the plumbing. They created the financial plumbing.
But even in the 19th century, what's interesting about that, so by the time the children inherit the father's empire in the 1830s, and it's really to the children, William in Liverpool and James in New York, the other 2 brothers sort of step aside. It's not temperamentally suited. They were quite competent. There were 4 of them. So the 2 sons, who then sort of give the business over next generation to one son in New York, and then a bunch of non-Brown partners in Liverpool, who then become the leaders of the Bank of England. What's amazing is that they knew they were born on third base. They didn't pretend they had hit a triple. And their whole mantra, and the mantra of the father and the sons to the sons to the sons, was, if you're born on third base, you had better think about what your responsibility is to the larger society that you are in a position of privilege towards. So the other aspect of their culture was, we can't thrive privately unless the commons on which we're embedded thrives as well. And that's why they helped build the B&O Railroad in 1828 to kind of make Baltimore competitive with Philadelphia and New York, not because funding a railroad was going to make them any money, and it did not make them any money. They, unlike a lot of other railroad investors, didn't lose all their money. But it wasn't done for that. It was done as a public works funded by private money for public good.
Right.
And that's another aspect of them that I found fascinating, is this idea of, if you're born on third base, claim it. Don't pretend that, you're like special. You are special. You're not special because you're better. You're special because you're privileged. And if you're privileged, own it. And then what are your responsibilities to the larger society?
So at the time, you keep bringing up the B&O. So let's talk about B&O Railroad, monopoly fame. So B&O Railroad, Baltimore, Ohio, is a really important point, because at that time, travel within the United States, it was enormously difficult. Just to travel from New York to Baltimore, which now you can do in about a 4-hour drive, took about 4 days.
Yeah,
I think it was
and that's if the weather was good.
Right. To get from Boston, I remember reading in Ron Cherno's book on, McCullough's book on Adams. It was easier to go from Boston to New York via the Atlantic Ocean than it was riding your horse. Yeah. It was through these Indian trails, which were extremely small and narrow, and it was cold and hazardous, and it just took such a long time. And that's another thing we take for granted, is we're able to transport goods throughout this country from point to point seamlessly, where to do that back in the day, and then the advent of the B&O, was to create a railroad, which was it was the Tesla of its day. Agreed?
Exactly.
It was
the moonshot.
It was a moonshot, right? It was a moonshot. And
it was done entirely because the biggest change in those years was the opening of the Erie Canal from Albany to Lake Erie and Buffalo, because that allowed for water transport from the original coastal areas over the Adirondacks to what was then the Ohio Valley, or the opening of that kind of area of the United States. And that's partly what gave New York such incredible advantages, right. The Erie Canal. Right. I mean, it had other advantages, a great harbor, but that was the real leapfrog moment. Philadelphia started building a canal, the Susquehanna, which was also going to connect Philadelphia to the interior.
Right. So let me start. I want our listeners to definitely get up to speed on this. Moving goods from the East Coast, where they were coming in from all ports, from really England and other countries, and France, coming to New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. Now, as the country expanded westward, you now had to get these goods from point A to the West. And the West was a formidable barrier. There were mountains, there were valleys, there were waterways. It was a technological marvel that they had to get goods from point A. So the way to do it then was through the canal system, through waterway. Right. These guys came up and said, you know what? We're going to do a moonshot. And the moonshot is a steam railroad.
Right.
You got to be crazy.
They did it because they were behind, right? So that it would.
Baltimore was behind. Baltimore was behind, right?
Baltimore was behind. So that by the time they could have built a canal, it would have been too late in Philadelphia and New York City, and to some degree, the District of Columbia, which was also funding a canal. And just to your point, for anybody who understands the geography of the United States, there are no east-west waterways, natural waterways, big ones in the United States. I mean, the Ohio River kind of does a diagonal, but not between sort of the Mississippi and the Atlantic. So
it's north-south axis.
It's all north-south, and everything else is sort of mountains. So any way to get east-west, human beings had to create, and it was both a moonshot and a Hail Mary simultaneously, to use two cliches. And they said, look, we're going to be behind, so we're going to do this thing. There had been one small passenger railroad in Manchester, or in that area of the Midlands in the UK. And they didn't even know that steam engines would work. They had a whole contingency of they were going to have the train drawn on tracks by horses.
Which, by the way, you read in the book, they tried that. It was a race to see if that technology or the new technology, which the big thing with, which I started reading more books about. I really need to read a lot more. There was one book I forgot that dealt with all about the steam engine being a revolution. These things blew up. They were hazardous.
Yeah. And in fact, that there was a test race for the Baltimore and Ohio with the directors. And the horse actually wins because the steam engine explodes at the end. Right. Which was always a problem, right? You never want your engine to explode. And so, I mean, people died. Like trains were dangerous. People died on trains in these years.
Yeah. And look, by the way, but trains were an issue way into the 1870s and 80s when you had east-west and west-east were going on the same tracks. So the timing had to be perfect. And that's where they created, just as an aside, totally parenthetic, because I collected pocket railroad watches, these things had to be accurate because so many lives were lost when they used the same track and they would, crash. So they used to have these watches, these railroad watches that needed to be, the railroadmen had to pay for it on their own. They were spot checked they had to be within, I think, 10 or 15 seconds or whatever in different positions. So we take a lot of this stuff for granted. But just moving goods from point A to point B was not only hazardous, not only costly, but in many cases impossible because of nature.
Right. So they build this thing, but they don't put up all the money. And they kind of galvanize both the entire city of Baltimore, the citizens of Baltimore. There's a stock issue that raises a public stock issue. And people invest in it the way they would invest in war bonds later on. Patriotic is probably the wrong word, but as an act of civic engagement. And the state of Maryland puts in some money. The federal government in these years, one of the big contests before the Civil War was should or how much should the federal government spend on public works and infrastructure. Now we're having a debate about whether or not we should spend $1 trillion on roads and high-speed internet. In those years, it wasn't even clear to people that the federal government had been empowered to spend any money on infrastructure,
especially interstate. Why should Rhode Island pay taxes for Maryland to build a railroad?
So there had been some money for the Cumberland Road, which was a big, another big public works. But basically, the Baltimore and Ohio was funded, yes, by the state of Maryland, but not by the federal government and by the Brown family. And it eventually gets built, but like everything else, it takes longer, it costs more than expected. And frankly, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the sense of it doesn't make Baltimore competitive as an economic hub compared to Philadelphia, but certainly compared to New York. And frankly, New York had so many advantages at that point that it's not clear that anything could have changed that trajectory. But it certainly changes the railroad trajectory in the United States.
It creates it. It's the start, right?
Yeah.
It's the whole system.
And what's fascinating is the Browns then don't get involved in the later 19th century railroad boom.
That's speculation. These guys stayed away from all sorts of speculation.
And as anybody knows who's looked at this, the people who made money on the railroads in the late 19th century were almost never the people who built the railroads. Right? The people who built the railroads, who funded the first railroad companies, went bankrupt. The people who made the money, the J.P. Morgans and the Fricks and the Huntingtons, most of them made money buying the bonds for pennies after the initial investors went bust.
The original value investors, right?
Yeah.
Right. All the risk was taken out. They were basically buying a track.
Distressed asset.
Yeah, distressed asset, pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
And they controlled huge amounts, and created monopolies. Okay. So they create this B&O Railroad, now possible to ship goods westward. And by the 1820s or so, the transatlantic trade is still dominated a big way by cotton. So everyone's making money on cotton in so many different ways. Move forward another 30, 40 years or so, steam engine, what do you call it? The ships, the steamships. There's one to get mail, M-A-I-L, physical, postal mail, snail mail was a big deal.
Yep.
To get it from one side of the Atlantic to the other. Tell us about that.
So the Royal Mail, the British Royal Mail, which is part of the British government, pays for an upgrade in the transatlantic mail trade. And they support Samuel Cunard, who is a Canadian Nova Scotian who creates what becomes the Cunard lines, which is the most people know from the Titanic. It was Cunard and White Star that did the Titanic. The American version of it was funded by Brown and a man named Edward Knight Collins, and it's called the Collins line. And Edward Knight Collins is like a P.T. Barnum figure. He's this prototypical hustler. He's the kind of guy who like buys nice clothes but can't be bothered to button his shirt. And he's every bit the hustler, crude, and he's exactly the kind of person that the Brown family, the next generation, the sons, would have really looked down on, as a provincial hustler, speculator, risk taker. But James Brown, who's the younger son, who'd taken over the New York office, was feeling in the family dynamic overshadowed by his brother William, who was becoming really the head of the house. And he's convinced by Collins to help underwrite these new steamships.
Which, by the way, let me just interject, which is a big risk. This is outside of their wheelhouse, pun intended. So
it's like William had wanted to do the same thing in the late 18 teens. He'd wanted to open a cotton mill. And he tried to convince his father, like, we'll put the money in, we'll do a cotton mill. We're doing the cotton trade. Why don't we vertically integrate and start making the cloth? And the father says, oh, my son, that's such a dumb idea. Right. People who do that, who don't stick to their last, who diversify, they're the ones who lose money, who get into too many business lines.
By the way, this is Warren Buffett, right? Stay within your circle of competence. Going outside their circle of competence, the father wisely saw that we're not going to have any competitive edge. What are we doing?
So James, he wants to show up his brother, wants to make a mark, and he's convinced by Collins to put in $1 million of the firm's money, which was a good chunk of money then. It was not enough, quote unquote, to sink the firm if it had all been lost. So it was risk capital, but it wasn't like betting the farm. But it still was a venture. And Collins eventually, because of the Mexican War, convinces Congress to subsidize the Collins line. It's basically saying to them, look, the English are owning the transatlantic trade with the Cunard line because the British government's paying for the ships. Do you really want that? And when the Mexican War comes on and everybody gets nationalistic and full of national security, and people in Congress are saying, we can't let the British own the transatlantic trade, we have to have our own ships, then Collins is able to convince Congress to start underwriting the Collins line for like 8 years. And these are expensive. Like each ship was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Which
and the reason the reason the government's subsidizing this, because they're carrying the U.S. mail back and forth, yes. Right? Because the U.S. mail was being carried by English ships, by the right. So it was national pride as well that motivated them to do that.
And it was an awareness that as the United States continued to get more powerful, there was a vestigial sense of, we're going to want a navy. We're not going to want the sea lines owned by the British forever. So there was also that future-looking aspect to it. And Collins becomes, publicly prominent. The ships are fast. They market themselves partly on trying to break speed records for the crossing.
How long does it take? How long does it take to get?
It cuts down from like 4 to 7 weeks from wind. To anywhere from like 10 days to 20 days, depending. I mean, the westward crossing has the speeds are very different depending on the winds.
So you think about that. That cuts the travel down by, let's say, 70%.
Yeah,
that's like someone coming up with an invention today to fly from New York to California, let's say 6 hours, to do it in close to 2 or 3 hours. That's pretty amazing.
And on a regular schedule, which had already started prior to that. These packet lines, were the first time that ships actually left at a set time and a set date. It used to be that ships left when their hulls were full of cargo. So you'd show up at the docks and say, I'm looking for passage. And they'd say, we're either going to leave tomorrow or we're going to leave in 2 weeks, depending on how long it takes us to fill up the hold. The packet lines and then the steamships left on a schedule, which also is, that's one of these boring things, but like other boring things.
Revolutionary. Yeah. You think about this now. If you wanted to ship something here, you put your goods on a truck. When is this going to be in California? As soon as we fill the truck up. Once the truck's filled, it could be a day, it could be another month and a half.
Right. Tough for perishables. So it's going quite well, except for the fact that it's economically not viable without government subsidy. And convincing the Congress to keep subsidizing it after the end of the Mexican War, because these things wax and wane, right? When people are like, oh, we've got to defend our shores and stand up against foreign adversaries or competitors, that crests during a war, and then the war ends and people are like, oh, why are we spending all this money? The British, meanwhile, keep spending all this money. And in fact, for a brief moment in 1852, it seems like the U.S. is actually going to own the transatlantic routes because all the Cunard ships are diverted to the Black Sea by the British government because of the Crimean War. But that's like a total false dawn. And then there's a huge disaster where the jewel of the Collins line sinks. The U.S. the Arctic sinks in a totally freak accident. Like ships rarely ran into each other. Just the sea lanes were not that crowded. So the ship sinks. James Brown's granddaughter and child die. They drown in the ship. They happen to be on the crossing. And it's used by the Brown family as a sort of cautionary tale. Yeah, they don't go so far. I mean, they're not arrogant enough to believe that God personally intervenes to teach them a lesson about speculation, which really would have been the height of sort of, Protestant arrogance, the idea that we're important enough for God to do this. But they certainly take it as we tried this sort of burst into the public, to be one of the hustlers, to be one of the movers and shakers.
It's not our way. It's not our way. This doesn't work. This doesn't work for us. And it's also a tragedy. A good part of the family dies. I think they're buried here in Brooklyn, right?
Yeah, at the Plymouth Church or near there. Although it's interesting, Henry Ward Beecher is the celebrity preacher, the Jimmy Graham of his day, Billy Graham, not Jimmy Graham, sorry. And Beecher takes this as an opportunity to really stick it to the Brown family. And Beecher's a interesting, colorful character, ends up having one of the trials of the century, his own adulterous affair that becomes this media event later on. But he basically uses the sinking of the ship to thunderously decry the materialism and greed of Americans, of whom the Browns he holds up as Exhibit A. He doesn't go quite so far as to say it, but he basically says God is punishing the capitalists and the Brown family.
Right.
And so we mourn the loss of life and all that, but they had it coming.
And just as a side note, a footnote to history, his sister is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who writes Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah,
is the cause of one of the, when Lincoln meets her, goes, so you're the little lady that caused this war. Yeah. So, okay. So this is a big deal. So we're in the 1850s now, and so you see the Harrimans, the Brown brothers rather, they're in the beginning phase of creating a capital market system. Then they're behind transportation. I'm sorry, before that, letters of credit, facilitating buyer and seller, acting as a merchant bank, exchange rates, capital markets, now behind transportations, and you never hear about them. They just blend into the background.
And they do that because they're not willing to speculate in the railroads, but they're willing to make a lot of money doing a lot of other stuff, and they are willing to be in second position. So a lot of the railroad deals, when these things were refinanced, are syndicates. J.P. Morgan makes a huge amount of money because he becomes the leader of a lot of syndicates. It's not like Morgan is putting up all this Morgan money to buy the vestiges of the Union Pacific or the Central Illinois or all the different railroads that he's invested in. He says, okay, I'll put in I'll put in the first capital, and then he gets all these other people to put in capital. And the Browns are often part of those capital groups. They're just, not in the top 5 investors. So they'll put a little in here and a little in there and a little in here, but it's all within a risk spectrum of never too much to lose and never too exposed to any one line and never operating them, right. and never underwriting a new railroad. And I mean, to some degree, look, they could no more be totally not in railroads than an investor in the 1990s could totally not be in tech. But they're not underwriting the more risky and they steer clear of risk capital. And so they occupy niches of the market, like they get into like secondary finance. I mean, this is very wonky stuff, and I don't actually write about this a lot in the book because it's too wonky even for me. What they were doing in the 1880s and 1890s, just like what they're doing today, is pretty wonky, but it's necessary, right? It's the lubrication to the system, and their willingness to kind of make quiet money, I think, is also an underrated necessity in a financial system.
So let's move forward. Let's move all the way to when Prescott Bush and the Yale crowd and all the WASPs come into play in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. The firm becomes the really the poster child of where all these people of good breeding and who believe that they're destined to run the markets.
And they believe that because that message has been hammered home by the Brown family, by these letters, with great power comes great responsibility, the Spider-Man theory of history, the playing fields of Groton, and they all go to Groton, right? The Roosevelts all go to Groton, the Browns all go to Groton, they all go to Yale. And those schools at this time are the finishing schools for the elite. And I say that actually not with any particular judgment. They were the finishing schools in that their importance was less about what anyone learned. I mean, it was a rote curriculum. They, memorized Livy and learned Latin, but it was really much more about training their character and preparing them to be the leaders of society, in the belief that if you're privileged and you've got money and you're white and you're male and you're Protestant, you have a responsibility to lead society, and that's your role. And the Browns, like, that's their mother's milk. And that's really crystallized at Yale in the 1910s, when all these who would soon become the leading partners of the firm in the 1930s, and you alluded to Prescott Bush, who's the patriarch of the Bush family dynasty. Most people don't realize that Prescott Bush's money, the money that leads to the Bushies, is a combination of Harriman Railroad money and Brown Brothers financial money. And another partner was Robert Lovett, also a combination of the Harriman and Brown families, who eventually becomes Assistant Secretary of War in World War II, helps create the modern Air Force, becomes the second number two to George Marshall, both at the State Department and Defense Department. And in that role is crucial to, the creation of the atomic bomb, the creation of the modern Air Force, the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is the precursor of the WTO, the National Security Act of 1947, and then, of course, Averell Harriman himself, who occupies like 10 different roles, from Secretary of Commerce, Ambassador of Moscow, Governor of New York, Assistant Secretary of State, and then also one of the architects of Vietnam, the policy toward Vietnam under Kennedy. And Lovett, too, becomes an advisor to both Kennedy and Johnson as the wise men. And they do this because they believe they had a responsibility to serve. Right?
Where does Barbara Bush's family come in? I'm sorry, Prescott's wife,
Dorothy.
Yeah, she's
Dorothy Walker.
Walker, yes,
is the daughter of George Walker, who had been hired by Averell Harriman to be the president of Harriman & Co., Harriman's investment firm in the 1920s, which is the product of E.H. Harriman's railroad fortune. And George Herbert Walker was apparently not so good at running a firm, but I don't think Harriman actually really wanted anyone to run his firm. I mean, he hired someone to do it because he needed to, but he was not so good at delegating, and his younger brother Roland ends up running more of it. But Walker was a really good golfer and a great man about town. He liked buying houses, including the one in Kennebunk, which becomes Walker's Point. So that's the Walker money. And then Prescott himself starts working at Harriman. And then when Harriman and Brown Brothers merge in 1930 as a kind of as a defense against the Great Depression, Prescott becomes one of the junior, but then leading partners of Brown Brothers Harriman in the 1930s.
And bring us to today. Where's Brown Brothers today?
So weirdly enough, they still exist. They have 5,000 employees. They make somewhere between $2 and $2.5 billion in revenue, and they probably make between $500 and $100 million a year in profit. which is a lot of money, right? I mean, it may not be a lot of money compared to Goldman Sachs, and it's not a lot of money compared to JP Morgan. But for like a human organization that remained a partnership in a private company, it's more than like, huh. And what's interesting is back to what you began the interview with. You passed them, you never knew anyone worked there. They're never in the news, right? No, there's no Brown Brothers. The last time Brown Brothers was on the front page probably was when the partners retired in 1968. When Lovett, Bush, and Harriman kind of all retire in 1968 after they have a 150th anniversary party. And if they were publicly traded, I don't know if they would be $8 billion, $15 billion, a big company for human terms of sort of a small to mid-cap company. The fact that we don't remember them and we don't even acknowledge them today, I think has to do with the perversion, and I use that word purposely, of what kind of financial capitalism has defined itself as. Not what it needs to be, but what it is, or a lot of what it is today. And that's a product of all these companies going public in the 80s, and Brown Brothers never goes public. It doesn't even occur to them. I kept trying to ask them, like, so why didn't you go public? And they're like, why didn't we become purple? I mean, it wasn't even part of their mindset to go public. And part of that is that when you go public, the incentive structure changes, right? If you're Tim Cook at Apple, you could make $10 million personally from a deal. You're never going to lose $10 million personally from a deal. That's going to be dispersed among shareholders. Brown Brothers, still, every deal they do, it's partners' money. And they could lose the money.
Some say that was the sea change in the early 80s of Wall Street, when Bear Stearns was a partnership and everyone sat down. Any deal you went into, it was your partnership capital on the line, and Goldman Sachs as well. And once you take that out, where it's heads I win, tails I don't lose, why the hell not?
Right. And that makes total sense from an incentive structure. And look, my point at the end about Brown Brothers is, one, there's also just the problem of human beings and what narratives we pay attention to. One of the ironies of Brown Brothers is that because of Glass-Steagall in 1933, they hive off their investment bank, which you had to do by law. You couldn't be a commercial and investment bank. Their investment bank, they stay a commercial bank because that was most of their business. Their investment bank eventually becomes Drexel Burnham Lambert, and eventually becomes Michael Milken. Say what you will about Milken. Milken becomes an icon of a particular moment in Wall Street, and famous and infamous. Brown Brothers becomes forgotten. And in a weird way, part of what I'm trying to say in the book is we shouldn't forget what is foundational to a system and lionize what is either toxic or really exciting, And that's a problem with how we understand capitalism. Like a capitalism that understands its responsibility to the larger society, that is unabashed in its pursuit of profit, but with a sense of where risk exists. And a capitalism that understands that private good is embedded in public good, is the story of Brown Brothers for 200 years, and it could be the story in the future. We choose the systems that we want to live in, ever present and into the future. Nothing is written, so we have the ability to continue to rewrite, redefine, recreate, recast, and I hope. Part of what the book does is it points in a different direction as to where capitalism could be than the one in which it is. And my final point about this is you don't want a world composed only of Brown Brothers. One, I don't want a Brown Brothers world because, you and I wouldn't have had a seat at that table. I mean, it was very exclusionary, and it was very, particular about who was allowed to be in those rooms. And the second thing is you don't want a capitalism world where only risk is driving decisions. You do want Tesla, right? You do want innovation. You do want someone who's willing to go.
Well, all the innovation that we've had, Brown Brothers would have never funded any of that.
Right. So you do not want a world of only Brown Brothers. But I think in the ratio, right? If you're talking about a hub and a periphery, or hub and spokes, today the hub has become risk capital. And that's probably overstating it, right? With all the regulations after 2008, 2009, the big money center banks are highly constrained about the risks they can take. So I understand this is a more complicated, but in bold terms, I think you want at the core of a capitalist system people who are profoundly mindful that money is power. And as power, it can do great good, but can also do harm. It's like a force of nature. It can deluge, it can irrigate. And you want the people who are at the epicenter of it to understand that alchemical power and be mindful and respectful of it. And then on the periphery, you want the Elon Musks and the hedge funds and the VC funds who are like, I want to try to get 100 to 1 from my money. I don't care if I do 9 zeros as long as 1 is a home run.
Yeah, because
and I think that's great.
Because without that, you wouldn't have the Googles of this world.
Right.
You know, they went to those places. So I do hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree. I do agree that there needs to be a balance. But I think what I'm trying to get, what I'm really hearing from you also, is not money and power for its own sake, but in combination of, I don't want to be trite in saying this, but in doing good, in terms of the responsibility that this gives you. You can't just take money and accumulate it for its own sake.
Right.
You were privileged to get that. You were in and I think they all felt, and correct me if I'm wrong, they all felt they were in a responsible position, and this just wasn't something that, wow, I'm part of this great thing, let me go piss money out the window. Let me have, buy $2,000 bottle of champagne or go to a strip club. They didn't do that. They said, with this power, let me see how I can serve the greater good, because in turn, it will benefit me as well as society.
Right. Self-interested selflessness. Right.
That's true. That's true. And nothing wrong with that. It's
no?
And look, we swing to extremes. One extreme is not going to be good, and the other extreme certainly is not going to be good. There has to be this seesaw that it doesn't go up or down. It just kind of hovers in the middle somewhere. I think that would be the ideal, which, you have some business leaders today who do that.
But I think not enough in the financial world. And I think Brown Brothers can represent a possible path, and the fact that they're still around and amazingly profitable, and we don't pay attention to them.
Yeah, but they're not profitable on the scale of, you look, I hear what you're saying. But, in 2007, 2008, I think, all these guys got spanked. You go to the extreme of risk, and in order to make huge amounts of return, huge leverage, you end up with these once every 10, 20, I would say every 10 years, you come into these kind of attitude adjustments. And the system does change. But in terms of making money, some of these, their net revenue, their net profit, Brown Brothers, is maybe half of what some hedge funds guys made last year.
Totally. But you also want a world of people who are responsible corporate citizens who are not flashy, right? You like, the world cannot be composed back to the singles and the home runs thing. You want
so you want a world of Elon Musks. That's really my question, right? Yeah. You want a few Elon Musks. You want a few Steve Jobs. But in terms of the rest, you want more Warren Buffetts. You want more Charlie Mungers. I do hear what you're saying. I can't make a conclusionary statement as to what the ideal is, because the answer is it depends. When risk on, risk off, there are certain times we should be putting on, hitting the pedal to the metal, and other times we should be taking our foot off the gas.
But to echo what you just said, which is in the book, the idea is no matter which of those parts of the equation you're on, the idea that there is a public good that you are responsible to, I think, is essential for everybody. Like nobody gets a pass on that equation. And I'm particularly critical of tech elites today, even more than financial elites, who seem to be, in some sort of la-la land about the public dimensions of their private effects. And we would all be better served by constantly creating a culture that is aware of the connectivity between, there's no man's an island, no company can do this alone. We are all part of a larger society. And look, I know these things can sound hopelessly sort of idealistic in a cynical world, but I think we could also use some more idealism.
Okay, let's leave it there, man. I can't top that. That's, so that rules out Google, Facebook, a whole bunch of other companies just threw under the bus. But yeah, look, they I think in a capitalist system, it really cuts you down to size at some point, where they become too big and too overpowering, where the marketplace will look for an alternative, and we'll find it. And I remember back in the day, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the big thing was the antitrust against Microsoft and Internet Explorer. And the marketplace found a way to break that so-called monopoly. You know, they had new browsers come out, and where's Internet Explorer today in terms of the browser wars? And the marketplace took care of that. Yeah. I do, and I'm not an on-Ron type of guy, but I do hear what you're saying, and I don't know what the prop and mix is, but I'm glad you brought up the question. I'm glad you try to address it in the book. I didn't agree with everything at the end, you know, your conclusionary statements on that, or trying to really, I shouldn't say conclusionary. You're trying to come up to an end point of what you learned from all of this. Seeing the Brown Brothers on one side, seeing the Merrill Lynches during 2007, or Bank of America do the 2007, 2008, and trying to find, a medium. So, okay, I'm with you. Zachary Karabell, man, thanks so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. The name of the book, folks, is Inside Money, Brown Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power. It's a good read. I want to tell you, heavily researched, man. You did a phenomenal job doing that. In fact, at some points, I kept saying, how the hell does he know that? But I do remember listening to something you said on another podcast where their 150th anniversary, they basically made this an easy job for you, opening the archives, because they were there.
Yeah. So it was not the hardest research.
Yeah, but don't tell your publisher. Don't tell your publisher that. Let them think that you worked real hard doing that. All right, Zachary, thanks so much for being on the show, man. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Charles Mizrahi Show. If you're a new listener, welcome. If you've been listening for a while, we're glad to have you back. Either way, we'd love to know what you think of the show. Please leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Reviews make it easier for others to find the show. You can also see the video of the interview on the Charles Mizrahi Show channel on YouTube.